Hello, all. Going back to the 1960s and science fiction shows, this is one that I actually never watched, probably because I was way too young. It was Space Patrol from 1963. I was only 4 years old at the time, so I would have been too young to see it. But I would have enjoyed it quite a bit based on the fact I've watched all of the episodes on YouTube and found them very amusing, very interesting, and it was actually rather well done puppet show for the time, comparable in some ways to Jerry Anderson's Fireball XL5. Uh, it was created and written by Roberta Leigh and Arthur Provis, both of whom had worked with Jerry Anderson. In fact, the AP and AP Films, the P is for Provis, it's Anderson Provis Films. Roberta Leigh had worked with Anderson as a puppeteer and director on his two earlier shows, The Adventures of Twizzle and Torchy the Battery Boy, and I believe she left slightly before the next one, which was Four Feather Falls, which was technically the first Super Marionation show where they synchronized the characters to pre-recorded lips, movements to pre-recorded dialogue, um, which made things a little more interesting, if not in that particular show realistic, because they had things like a talking horse, and horses don't talk, so that's not realistic, but it was interesting anyway. Um, and It was directed by Frank. All the episodes were directed by Frank Goulding. The characters were it takes place in the year 2100 at Space Patrol, which is a place where men from Earth, Mars, and Venus work to maintain galactic peace, or peace throughout the solar system. It's actually not an intergalactic; it's only intersolar system. But the principal characters are Captain Larry Dart, who was played by Dick Vosberg. Husky was a Martian who speaks with kind of a Slavic accent, played by Ronnie Stevens. There was a Venusian called Slim. I believe he was played by Yasen Churchman, though it's not specified. Who played Olivia Morris, played a character called Marla, who was the secretary of General Rayburn. General Rayburn was played by Murray Cash, and he was Rayburn is the commander, and Marla is his secretary. She's also a Venusian. There are 39 half-hour episodes, and they worked for something called the United Galactic Organization, and their spaceship was very interesting. It was sort of donut or torus shaped, and it didn't launch vertically like Fireball XL5. It launched horizontally right from the top of the Space Patrol building, which I thought was very cool. They usually flew a ship called Galasphere 347, but at other times they used Galasphere 024, and there was also mention of at least one other Galasphere 101, throughout the program. And the plots were fairly simple for the time. There'd be a threat to Earth from either the people from Neptune who like to enslave people because they didn't like to work, or strange plant-like characters from Uranus, which were actually living beings called duos who were trying to take over the world for some unknown reason. And Captain Dart and Galasphere 347 would have to go and stop them, or try and reason with them, or come up with answers. There's also a very funny character, the Professor Aloysius O'Brien O'Rourke Haggerty, and I don't know who did his voice. Again, it's not specified. He also had a daughter, Cassiopeia, and he's always telling her, "Don't call me Pop." She'd say, "What are you doing, Pop?" She'd say, "I'm going to get on a time watch and don't call me Pop." He was always come up with these brilliant answers to the problems that they had. Like, there was a episode where things on Pluto was getting too cold, and the people there were freezing to death, and they had to figure out some way to heat it up. And he came up with a way to transmit radio waves from Mercury to Venus, and then they'd be transferred back into heat rays. And because radio waves travel at the speed of light, they could transfer them quickly, and that's actually true. There was a science advisor on the show, although they did get a lot of science wrong for the time. But again, one has to remember this was produced in 1962 and came out in 63 when they didn't know a lot of things. They didn't know that there was no life on Mars or Venus, or that the surfaces of Saturn and Jupiter were just gas. There was no solid surface, so they couldn't have a landing on Jupiter or Saturn, they couldn't be, colonies of beings living, though the Saturnians were kind of interesting. It looked like kind of like four-armed intelligent dinosaurs, which I thought was very interesting design. And again, some of the puppets and the architecture of the futuristic city was great. They ride around in these tubes and these things called monobiles, which are basically like people movers or an individual transport system. And the city itself is very futuristic looking. There are all these weird electronic sounds, which were actually composed. That music was composed by Roberta Leigh herself, but it was played by a guy named F.C. Judd, who was an electronic experimental musician. And there's no soundtrack. Oh, there are only like weird electronic noises. There's no music in the show at all. Um, some great things. They when they have to go on a long mission, they're put into quote unquote the freezer, which is suspended animation. And that's rather advanced for its time. Um, and whenever they come out of the freezer, Husky's hungry. And he always says, "I want some Martian sausages." He's talked in a Slavic accent, which is probably because Roberta Leigh, her parents were Slavic and Jewish, and they had like thick Russian accents, and so he talks with one, which is kind of odd since he's supposed to be a Martian. There's also a very very funny comic relief character called Gabler, who is a quote unquote gabaledictum. He's a Martian parrot. And in one of the episodes, much to his regret later, Professor Haggerty creates a birdsong translator which allows him to teach Gabler how to speak English. And once he does, will not shut up. He's just always talking blah, 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 blah. He's just going on and on and on. And even though he sometimes has some good ideas, they're always telling him to shut up and, kind of following off his ideas when in fact he's actually right in a number of episodes. And they actually take him along on a couple of missions where they're not supposed to take animals or birds on the galaspheres. But in one where they go to Mars and they're trying to stop some counterfeiters, he proves to be very useful because he finds where they are. And by talking to other gabaledictums on Mars, which I thought was a good plot and interesting. They're actually very well written for what's obviously meant to be a kid's show. There's a lot of repetition, like the launch sequence is almost always exactly the same. Um, some of the planetary backgrounds look the same, but again, I understand they had a limited budget. You couldn't do like a new planet every time. You had to use like the same things. And basically all the planets were either a jungle or a desert, which I thought was kind of, a good sort of time-saving measure, on their part. They didn't have to have, exotic planets, just had, jungles. And since, again, this all took place inside the solar system, there were only two where I think they were supposed to be on Andromeda, but again, the planet that they go to called Delta, it was in Alpha Centauri, uh, was a planet orbiting Alpha Centauri, though I think they probably meant Proxima Centauri. Alpha is a blue-white gas giant and probably can't support Earth-like planets, but Proxima actually does have a planetary system. Um, there's a kind of a strange being who doesn't have a mouth, he just has like a big eye, and he's sort of ghost-like looking, and they travel there by, the being installs a special drive on their ship, which allows them to travel much faster than the speed of light, and therefore, otherwise it would have taken them 3,000 years to get there, they said. So their spaceship is limited. It can't go everywhere unless they use special things. It's powered by what's called a meson drive, which I thought was interesting. They also use gamma rays and something called Yaba rays, and they don't ever explain what a Yaba ray is, except in one episode when they could not see the surface of Venus because there were lots of storms. Husky says, "I'll turn on the Yaba rays," and then he can see. So it's obviously something akin to an X-ray. Also, when they're in the quote-unquote freezer, they'll set it for like a certain maximum period of time, like for a trip to Venus takes 3 weeks, so they'd set it for 21 days. And but if there's an emergency, Marla can use something called a Zergon ray to wake them up from their pre-programmed sleep cycle. And they do that in a couple of episodes. And I thought that was interesting scientifically. The ship also has a force field, which when they're using it, they can't communicate, but it prevents things like the Neptunians are telepathic and they try to hypnotize people. Well, they can't do that when they turn the force field on because it blocks their telepathic thoughts. And again, I thought that was interesting. Also, when they go into the freezer, they put the ship on quote unquote robot control, and a robot actually walks into the screen and like starts working on the controls. Apparently, every time they use that shot, it cost them £1,000, which is really kind of remarkable considering the robots are very clunky looking in this. They're not as sophisticated, say, as Robert in Fireball XL5. They're very kind of spindly looking robots, and they talk in very mechanical voices. But again, that's, something that's not really important. The architectural designs done by Roland Whiteside are really terrific. The models done by Derek Freeborn are really great, again, akin to anything that Derek Meddings was doing on Fireball XL5 at the time. And the stories are very similar. Again, people argue, well, they're kind of saying, well, it's a kid's show. Obviously they're going to be kind of samey. The hero has a challenge. The hero has to meet the challenge. The hero defeats the challenge. That's basically, the structure of just about any TV show. So, that's kind of a silly argument. I thought it was very good. They're all really interesting. And as I said, they're all available in their original glorious black and white on YouTube. And I highly recommend watching them.